Oh. So this is a talk of the bit to Carranza Pinedo about Slurs, variability, emotional dimensions of the game-theoretic pragmatics. So, Slurs, it's yours.
Thank you. First of all, thanks to the organizers for putting together this conference, and I hope next time I will be there. So today we'll talk about slurs, slurs in particular, slurs variability and the relation to emotional dimensions. And I will talk about these topics from a game-theoretic perspective. So let's unpack this. So just picture a situation in which someone, let's call him John, has just been promoted. And his colleagues talk about it. So someone says, ask, was that speak John promoted? And the other person will automatically infer something like this, that the speaker thinks John and Latin Americans in general are the speaker vote for being Latin Americans, etc. So the term in red is a slur, which, as you may know, is a term that derogates groups on the basis of properties like religion, nationality, ethnicity, etc. So one property that is very hard to understand about the slurs is that they can receive very different interpretations depending on the context. So for example, the utterance in this example can be followed up by something like, I'm furious, he didn't deserve it, or I'm happy for him, he deserves it, in certain situations. So in situations in which the speaker maybe is also Latin American, or is a very good friend with the addressee, or etc. Or maybe a combination of different factors at the same time. But it is not only that slurs are variable on the from the point of view of what they express, but also from the point of view of what they elicit in other people. So on the one hand, they may express different emotions, but on the other hand, they can also trigger different degrees of offense. And in this case, offense is a very general concept that we might define as the formal object of anger. So when we ask to what extent something is offensive, we're asking something like, to what extent something can legitimately elicit anger. And there is a proposal which has been discussed in the literature, which is called expressivism, which says that slurs are offensive because they express certain kind of emotions. So in particular, according to the expressivists, slurs express emotions like contempt, and that would explain why they elicit so much offense in other people, in particular on the targets. However, this proposal has been criticized because, as we saw before, slurs can trigger can trigger interpretations which are different according to the situations. In some cases, the speaker expresses something positive, in other cases, an emotion which can be characterized as negative, but offensiveness seems to be orthogonal or independent of the polarity of the emotion which has been expressed. So someone can be offended by a slur even though the speaker was trying to make a friendly comment or was trying to express joy, etc. And another kind of criticism to expressivism has been that emotions are not the whole story in the case of slurs, because there are many different factors that contribute to the offensiveness of the slur. So for example, historical oppression, and for other people, taboos. For other people, what is important is that there are institutions that support racism or homophobia, etc., which contribute to the degree of offensiveness of a slur. So the goal of my presentation will be to defend expressivism and in particular explain the variability of slurs. So on the first part of my talk, I will talk about affective content and how we can define affective content. And I will use emotional dimensions instead of emotional categories such as contempt. And my hypothesis will be that we should focus not on the balance or pleasure dimension, but on the dominance dimension of slurs. And in the second part, I will talk about how we can translate this hypothesis into a model, a game-theoretic model, to understand the main interpretations that we can obtain from the utterance of a slur. So on the first part, I would like to highlight that expressivism usually proposes that slurs express emotional categories like contempt or joy or etc. So, so that slurs express emotional categories such as contempt, and that this fact would explain their offensiveness. So it is based on a view of emotions, which is based on emotions as discrete states. But I think that this view of how emotions are expressed through language or through slurs in particular simplifies a little bit the picture, because slurs sometimes can express fear. For example, the xenophobic or the homophobic can be seen as someone who has fear of other people, or even amusement. So in some cases, people that is joking about some groups is expressing amusement by using the slurs as someone expenses. So contempt is not the only emotion that we can obtain, or we can interpret as being expressed by a slur. And moreover, slurs are also come in different intensities. So there are slurs which are more offensive than others, or also depending on the context, the same slur can be more offensive than in other cases. So the alternative I would like to propose is to use emotional dimensions instead of emotional categories. Now, typically we have 3 dimensions, which are pleasure, which is also called valence, which refers to the degree of pleasure experience, which can be positive or negative. We also have arousal, which is the degree of energy or excitement, which is experienced during the emotional episode. And we have a third element, which is dominance, which is the degree of control experienced during the emotional episode, which can be submission, or can be, on the other hand, a feeling of power or control. And because dominance is not so discussed in the literature in general, I will talk a little bit more about it. So dominance as an affective dimension refers to how freely an agent feels when he is stimulated by something. So how many options he has in response to that object. And what is interesting about dominance is that it's inversely proportional to the dominance that is evaluated from in the stimulus. So in the case of pleasure or valence, you have that the pleasure you obtain is directly proportional to the pleasure that you judge the object to provide. But in the case of dominance, is the opposite. So you have a different kind of relation. It's inversely proportional to how you judge the dominance of, for example, a dog that is attacking you. So on the one hand, we have, so in these pictures, you can see 2 different kind of responses. One of them can be interpreted as anger, the other one as fear. The 2 of them are negative. The 2 of them can be very highly arousing. Nevertheless, one of them co-occurs with dominance, and in the other case, we have a lack of dominance because the agent is escaping the situation and he cannot do much. And I think that dominance is not only related to physical strength, to aggressiveness in the most physical interpretation, but also to social status, so social relations, social hierarchies that can affect how dominant or how non-dominant an agent can feel. So what is the relation between slurs and these dimensions? So on the first, we have that it is standardly assumed that slurs express negative evaluations, negative pleasure. In the case of arousal, I think that slurs can be felicitous either in cases in which the speaker is super excited, super energetic, or not. Maybe he can just make a racist comment by using a slur without even without screaming or like feeling excited. And I think that dominance is also very present in the case of slurs. So slurs express a high degree of dominance because they not only express a negative evaluation of the target group, but also that the target group is lesser than others. In a social hierarchy, they are like put down in the social hierarchy with respect to the speaker, with respect to the group to which the speaker belongs. This concords to what people say in the literature, which is that the slurs are part of speech acts of subordination. They rank people as lower or as inferior. And note that it is true that negative evaluations and high dominance can correlate in the case of slurs. So sometimes they happen at the same time, but they are not always co-occurrent. So for example, someone can make a positive evaluation of some group by using a slur. So he's expressing dominance, but at the same time, he's expressing something positive, like for example, when he says Fs are hardworking. And we have also the opposite case, a case in which you can evaluate someone negatively without implying that that person should be considered lesser than other people. So in the case of, for example, someone says, who is that bastard? So my hypothesis is that slurs, so as we saw in the introduction, slurs are offensive independently of the polarity of the emotion that they are considered to express. So they can express positive or negative evaluations, but they can be nonetheless offensive. So my proposal is that it is not valence, but dominance, which explains the offensiveness, the particular kind of offensiveness which slurs trigger. So by using the slur, the speaker typically presents himself as being superior, controlling, aggressive towards the target group, which is assumed to be inferior. So now the question is how we can translate this hypothesis into a model of communication, on how people interpret and use slurs in actual situations. And the answer is a computer. So I will propose a program which is based on a rational speech act model of communication in which the speaker and addressee reason about each other recursively in order to understand what are their communicative intentions. So the whole model looks like this, but I will only focus on the basic ingredients of the model, beginning by the stereotypical speaker. And I want to highlight, to remark that this model is very inspired by Heather Burnett's work on social meaning. But we will see now which are the differences between the model I am proposing for effective meaning and her model of social meaning. So first of all, I assume that there are two alternative utterances. So either the speaker uses the slur, decides to use the slur, or decides to use the non-slurring term. And then to define or to incorporate emotions into the model, I defined an affective space, which is based on the two dimensions that I discussed earlier, so valence and dominance. And we have four different quadrants that I have labeled as contempt, amusement, anxiety, and affiliation. But please remember that these are just labels. So I am referring to the whole affective spectrum that you can find in each of these quadrants, not just to contempt or to amusement or to anxiety. These are just labels that we can use. So on the one hand, we have alternative utterances. On the other hand, we have four different types of affective states. And the first hypothesis we can make about the relationship is that there is a relation of compatibility between slurs and, for example, contempt. And in that case, contempt would be incompatible with the opposite affective state, that would be affiliation. And in the case of the utterance, which doesn't contain the slur, we have the opposite behavior. So we have compatibility with affiliation, amusement, and anxiety, but not with contempt. The problem with this proposal is that expressives and slurs in particular are related to affective states in different degrees. They are not just related to contempt and amusement in the same way. They are more related to contempt than to anxiety or amusement, for example. So my proposal is to use what Henderson and McCready have called stereotypical speakers, so idealized agents, and they are used in this kind of reasoning to talk about how people typically use slurs. So I assume that slurs are typically used to express contempt, but also in some degree amusement or anxiety, etc. Please note that amusement in this case is amusement at the expenses of some group. So when people is joking in a racist way or homophobic way. So what about prior beliefs, which is one of the most difficult topics, not only for this model, but in general for game-theoretic models. And here things become complex because when people interpret someone's emotions, they use different factors at the same time in order to give the best inference to what emotion is experienced someone. So typically there are factors like, for example, the beliefs that we assume that someone has, or the events that happened before. So for example, the promotion of John, etc. Then you can use also the expressions that come after, that come because of the emotion, because the emotion has happened. For example, emotional expressions, posture, intonation, etc., or the actions of the speaker, like running or screaming, etc. So you use different factors. In the case of slurs, I think that what we are doing is to understand the emotions of the speaker on the basis of an emotional expression, which would be the use of the slur. And I think that in the literature on the slur, many people have proposed different explanations of why slurs are offensive by taking into account only one or two of these factors. So some people propose that slurs are offensive because there are prohibitions to say that those kind of words, or because there is a history of systemic oppression or socioeconomic differences, or because the speaker identity is important and we should allow people that belong to the group derogated to use the word in order to reclaim it, but etc. We have different factors that are proposed as being the source of the offensiveness. But I think that all of these proposals have something right. We use all of these factors in order to interpret the emotion expressed by a slur. In consequence, also to interpret how offensive is the slur. And these different factors are weighed differently for different people according to their own biases. So what about the literal listener, which is proportional to the prior beliefs you have about the speaker and the stereotypical speaker? So we have two different utterances, as I said, and we can calculate a field situation in which you have flat priors. So you assign the same, you assign a uniform distribution to, to, to the speaker feeling a certain emotion. So all these emotions are assigned 25%. And you obtain that in this case, the use of the utterance makes it more likely that the speaker is expressing contempt, because that is what typically slurs are used for. And also, you obtain that it is also possible that the speaker is using the slur to express amusement. In this case, amusement at the expenses of the group derogated. But let's look at a different case, which is the case in which the speaker is also Latin American. So in this case, we assigned 10% to the emotions which are which qualify as low dominant, and we assign high proportion to the other emotions. So in this case, we have that the use of the slur can be interpreted as expressing contempt, but the weight of these probabilities is super low. And we also have that the probability that the speaker is expressing something like affiliation raises a lot. So the speaker can use either the slur or the neutral counterpart to express positive attitudes like affiliation or solidarity, etc. So we see a case in which the positive interpretation of the slur arises. So let's take a closer look at situation 2. So I'm assuming that between members of the group derogated, it makes more sense to assume that they are not, they don't feel more dominant than other people that belong to the same group, because it would be very weird because they belong to that group. So that's why I assign a low probability to that case. But it is also the case that not all uses of slurs between members of the same group, between members of the group derogated, are expressing always solidarity or joy, etc. I think that there are many situations in which in-group uses are also expressing negative attitudes, even though they are not expressing dominance in those cases. So you can see members of the same group using the slur to express anxiety or frustration, even though there is no dominance in those cases. And we can also allow for cases in which a member of the group derogated uses the slur to convey the idea that he doesn't belong to the group. So it would be some sort of case of alienation. So he uses the slur to convey the idea that he's superior to that group because he doesn't belong anymore to that group, etc. Well, there are many situations that we can study using this model. So the conclusions are that affective meaning is not only multidimensional in a syntactic way. It's not just that affectivity is not true conditional, so it is expressed as a different dimension, but it's also ontologically multidimensional because you have different dimensions going on, like valence or arousal or dominance. And I think that variability is at the heart of expressive meaning, because, for example, there are many studies that show that even when you interpret facial expressions, you are using different cues in order to give an interpretation, like posture or like previous events. There are many factors that are taken into account, even for for a smile or for a sad face. And also, it is important to notice that it depends a lot on the speaker biases. So for some people, slurs are offensive because they violate prohibitions, for other people because there are institutions of racism, etc. And I think that we should take all these factors into consideration, not to consider just one as the main source. And that's all. Thanks.
We have almost 5 minutes.
I can't
over
hear
time,
you.
but, yeah, okay. Yes, please.
Thank you very much.
Could you come here and talk to the mic?
Thank you very much. So, in your talk, you have a reference from.
Sorry, I don't know why, but I don't hear anything. Maybe it's my
Okay.
computer.
So, in your, can you hear me?
Must be.
Okay. So,
Victor,
can you hear me?
no reaction.
What should I do?
Write a chat.
All right.
Maybe it's better to write a chat or. ここで音が跳ね返っちゃう。ここでは
向こうの設定だという。向こうの設定じゃない。
向こうの設定だけどでも、最初は入ればいいですよ。Victor, hello. Hi. Now he's away. But please, do you have a machine? Okay.
It doesn't work.
Okay, Victor, could you? Victor.
Sorry for this. I think it's my fault here.
No. Yeah, it's happened by sudden, so we can't do anything.
I will check again.
Please wait for a minute. The questioner is writing her question in the chat at the moment, so please wait a minute or so.
Sorry, it doesn't work. Maybe I can receive questions. Yeah, on the chat. Thanks.
And please write, we can hear his voice, then he can answer. Some. Sorry, wait a minute. Okay, you pick up hands.
Okay. Hello,
Chairman. Okay.
can you hear me?
Chairman.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thanks for your interesting talk. And what would you explain the relationship?
That's a good question because I haven't offered like
between
a comparison between
your
this model and the
dominance
model
and politeness, for
the volume
instance.
network.
Chairman, sorry.
So what is
Good
interesting
hear
in
your voice.
Burnett's proposal is that the personal linguistic style depends on many factors which go beyond language, right? They include clothes and like also the way the person presents himself, like in social settings. But one important difference is that she talks about identities, and identities are phenomena which is persistent over time. There can be, a person can be associated with many identities, right? One identity at home, one identity at work, but they are persistent because the person is building the identity when she speaks in a certain way or dresses in a certain way. In the cases of slurs, and in particular in this model, what I'm capturing is something more ephemeral, more because emotions are states that don't last much time, and you can obtain an inference that the speaker who uses a slur is racist and has different negative attitudes toward the group. But what the model is capturing is something that happens at a certain conversation, and the emotion can be different at a different point of the conversation, but that's also something that the model, I think, can incorporate at different anatomies over time. In the case of Burnett's work, one talks about the construction of an identity, right? Which is not something that we see much with affective states. There is no construction of an emotion in the same sense. I don't know if that answers the question.
Thanks. So
Thank you. I overpassed the limit. Thank you.
thanks. That was the answer to the question in the chat. And Jimmy, he can't hear your voice, so it's no sense to ask a question. Sorry. We closed the morning session with Victor's talk, and the afternoon session will begin at 1:30, but